My presentation this evening has had a curious evolution over the past few months, starting with an invitation from Sarah Moore to talk about the maritime history of Hallowell, and then, when I was slow to respond, a maritime history of the Kennebec. Then, an email from Earl Shuttleworth suggested that it be a talk on the maritime history of the Kennebec with an emphasis on shipbuilding and trade in Augusta, Hallowell, Farmingdale, and Gardiner. Finally, it was launched into the world as Shipbuilding, Trade, and Travel on the Kennebec River, a chapter in Hallowell's history. But speaking of the world, I'm more of a world historian than a local one, and when I talk about locales of any size, the rest of the world is always humming in the background. But as is the case with most current and former port cities, when talking about Hallowell, keeping the rest of the world in mind is easier than you might think. Before I get into specifics, though, I want to share a brief but relevant anecdote. Earlier this week, I was having lunch with a friend who told me almost apologetically that she was born in Illinois. She hastened to add that both her parents are from Gorham and that she's lived and worked most of her life east of the Kennebec. She even dropped the dreaded phrase, "from away." Now, I grew up and lived in the island communities of Manhattan and Brooklyn for 34 years, and when I moved to Portland, my first home on the mainland United States since I was 3, I was vexed to be told I was from away. Because in New York City, the oddities are people whose families have been there more than a couple of generations. What gives the city its dynamism is the constant churn of people, goods, and ideas. And this is true of all port cities, whether they are seaports, river ports, or airport cities. And it was certainly true of 19th century Hallowell, a river port that prospered from the surrounding region, but it kept its eye on the world beyond. This bird's-eye view of Hallowell, Kennebec County, Maine, is from 1878, 3 years after the last vessel was built here. Apart from 2 small craft built in the first half of the 1870s, shipbuilding here had effectively ended in the 1850s. The first 3 vessels known to have slid down the ways were built in 1785, and over the next 7 decades, another 210 vessels were launched here. These included substantial vessels, including 33 full-rigged ships, one of them classed as a clipper, 4 barks, 45 brigs, and 92 schooners. Interestingly, although Augusta, Farmingdale, Pittston, and Gardiner between them built 12 steamers, Hallowell built none. There are several things worth noting here. Zooming into the town, you can see there aren't many ways to get around, on foot or horseback, or in a horse-drawn vehicle. The streets aren't paved and there are no sidewalks. Hallowell was oriented more or less north-south, parallel to the river, and even in the 1870s, the few roads going inland were almost laughably bad. For longer trips, there were boats and ships and the railroad. The railroad from Boston, and thus the rest of the country, reached Portland in 1842. A decade later, the Atlantic and St. Lawrence line opened between Portland and Montreal via Lewiston. Canadian businesses were particularly anxious to have access to an ice-free port in the winter, and Portland was particularly anxious not to lose out to Boston. In 1852, the Kennebec and Portland Railroad linked Portland and Augusta via Brunswick, Richmond, and other river towns, including Hallowell. 4 years later, a new spur ran from Augusta to Waterville, which was already connected both to Portland via Lewiston and to Bangor. This signaled a major shift in the center of gravity on the Kennebec away from Hallowell. Railroad companies took a lead in urging the improvement of old and the construction of new roads because the mud of primitive dirt roads prevented farmers from getting goods to the train, and in good weather, railroad cars were overloaded, while in bad weather, they ran empty. The lack of suitable roads kept many businesses near rivers so they could receive and ship raw materials and finished goods. Lumber and other mills also depended on water power. This detail shows a number of major riverside industries: the Hallowell Granite Company, 2 oilcloth factories, cotton mills, the Hallowell Iron Foundry and Machine Shops, chalk, whiting, plaster, and grist mills, a shoe factory, and ice houses. As important as they were for overall progress, surfaced roads helped undercut towns like Hallowell too. The opening of the town's hinterland, combined with the rise of fuel-based industries, meant that manufacturing businesses no longer had to be near hydropower, while railroads and then cars and trucks siphoned off cargo from boats and ships, so industries were no longer tethered to the waterfront. The same was true for people, who could now live farther away from city and town centers, but still commute in to work. We should also notice the activity on the river itself. Most obvious are the dozen or so vessels, everything from small rowboats to 2- and 3-masted coasting schooners. Square Rug had run its course this far inland by now, as well as 2 steamers, a stern-wheel paddle ferry coming down from Augusta, and a steam tug towing a schooner against the prevailing south wind that is pushing another schooner upriver under sail. Between the Chelsea shore in the foreground and this trio of boats is what appears to be a log boom, one of many placed at intervals along the Kennebec for gathering logs so they could be sorted and sent on to particular mills. It seems that there are no logs in the boom in this image, which would mean this was rendered during the fall, after the log drives that began in the spring had played out. To get a sense of the impact of logging on the 19th century Maine landscape, note how few trees there are in and around Hallowell in the 1870s. This was partly the result of commercial logging, but settlers also had to clear land for houses and towns, and to grow crops and raise livestock so that they could actually live here. The recovery of the woods in this part of the world has been remarkable, though. According to the U.S. Forest Service, by 2007, 87% of the land in New England that was forested in 1630 had been reforested. The final element of this view of Hallowell deserving our attention are the 5 granite piers of the ill-fated Hallowell-Chelsea Bridge. Opened in 1860, this bridge ran from the foot of Winthrop Street to the foot of Ferry Road in Chelsea, which you can see in the inset curving down towards the river in the upper right of the slide. The bridge's builders hoped to capture traffic to a mineral spring that had opened in Togus. The spa failed, unfortunately, and then a succession of heavy rains and floods in the fall and winter of 1869 and 1870 destroyed the bridge, which had never seen much traffic in the first place. The 2-decked stern-wheel steamboat just beyond the larger pier is the Clarion, which connected Augusta and Hallowell with the Boston boat in Gardiner. The demise of the bridge meant a return to ferry service, and the rowboat between the first and second piers could be the ferry. Judging from this picture, at some point there was a chain ferry capable of taking relatively large loads, at least larger than a rowboat. At some point after World War I, the chain ferry, if that's what this is, was abandoned. A steam-powered vessel might have been a sound alternative, but the new ferry instead was a rowboat. The last ferryman in Hallowell, who rode between Chelsea and the town from 1931 until his death in 1960, 29 years later, his last boat was a flat-bottomed scow capable of carrying 6 passengers. Floods on the Kennebec are hardly a thing of the past, and the frequency with which the Kennebec overflowed into Hallowell was one reason for industries to move away from the river's edge once the river's advantages as a source of power and navigation lessened. The picture on the left shows 2 men in a punt at Beeman's Corner, the intersection of Water and Central Streets, during the flood of 1896. The record high water level caused by melting ice on the Kennebec stood for 40 years until it was eclipsed in March 1936. The photo on the right was taken from Academy Street looking south towards the neighborhood called Joppa. The damage from this flood was massive and ice took out sections of the 5-year-old steel truss bridge between Dresden and Richmond. By the way, the name Joppa apparently comes from the fact that it was a part of town where foreign seamen gathered. And foreigners generally lived. And it supposedly comes from the name of the old Levantine port of Jaffa, which is now basically part of Tel Aviv in Israel. Thus far, we've gotten a fairly good picture of Hallowell at an inflection point captured unintentionally, I'm sure, in its history. But what of the Hallowell in the decades before? The first great inflection point for the region, of course, was the coming of Europeans to Maine, which introduced not only diseases, but new languages, wholly new concepts of land and water tenure, engagement with the environment, architecture, boat building, and a raft of other technologies. The land was originally inhabited by Wabanaki tribes, of course, as is obvious from many of the surviving place names in the region, most notably Kennebec, which, its tendency to rage and flood notwithstanding, means something like large body of still water or large bay. When Europeans first arrived in the early 1600s, there were perhaps only 20,000 Wabanaki living on the land that is now Maine. Like the Europeans in Europe, indigenous people often warred among themselves, as well as with the English and to a lesser extent the French. Then, in 1616-19, about 75% of the population was wiped out by contagious diseases inadvertently borne by European sailors and settlers. With no natural immunity to diseases that originated in Eurasia and Africa, epidemics among native peoples would be a recurring problem. Members of the expedition that attempted to settle at Pemaquid in 1607 were the first to visit this part of the Kennebec and got as far upriver as Vassalboro using the shallop Virginia, otherwise known as Maine's first ship. As was their custom, the English claimed vast tracts of the Kennebec region. By the 1670s, Massachusetts had asserted control over Maine as far as the Kennebec. Yet English encroachment proceeded very slowly, starting with the establishment of a fur trading outpost at Cushnock, or Augusta, in 1628, and another trading post at Winslow in 1654. 30 years later, 6 Wabanaki leaders deeded land for settlement to Richard Wharton in an agreement stipulating that nothing in this deed be construed to deprive us, the Sagamores, successors, or people, from improving our ancient planting grounds, nor from hunting in any of said lands, being not enclosed, nor from fishing or fowling for our own provision, so long as no damage shall be done to the English fisheries. It wasn't until the mid-1700s that settlement on the Middle Kennebec took off with the establishment of the Kennebec proprietors, who laid claim to 15 miles on either side of the river from Merrymeeting Bay to Norridgewock. Among the proprietors were Boston merchants with names still sprinkled across the landscape today: Hancock, Bowden, Pitts, Gardiner, and, most notable this evening, Benjamin Hallowell. To protect the territory from encroachment from French Quebec, the English built Fort Western on the site of Cushnock. Named for Thomas Western, the fort was dismantled following the British victory at Quebec in 1759, which resulted in the Massachusetts frontier moving from the Kennebec all the way to the Penobscot. The next settlement after Fort Western was Hallowell, established in 1762 and incorporated in 1771. At the time, Hallowell encompassed Augusta and Chelsea on the east side of the river and part of what are now Farmingdale and Manchester. This part of Hallowell, known as the Hook, grew quickly. But in 1796, residents in the vicinity of the fort secured the right to build a bridge across the Kennebec, and the next year they seceded from the Hook, taking with them about two-thirds of Hallowell's territory, though only about half its population. Thanks to the advantages of its bridge, in 1799, Augusta became the seat of the new Kennebec County. Hallowell was a flourishing town, being for all practical purposes the head of navigation on the Kennebec, although if the conditions were just right, vessels could get as far as Augusta and even over the falls and as far as Waterville. At the time, Hallowell was the second largest market town in the state after Portland. Although Hallowell never hit much above 3,000, the region's population growth mirrored that of the state. This table of Maine's population between 1790 and 2020 shows how fast the state grew in the 75 years after independence. This was not a result of natural increase alone, but also immigration as people from away flooded into the state. The area around Hallowell proved conducive to agriculture, and in the early 1800s, the city could not only feed itself, but it also exported livestock, potatoes, and apples, mostly to Boston, but also as far afield as New Orleans. As it had been for the Wabanaki, the river itself was also a great source of sustenance. Captain John Drew, a Hallowell native who commanded ships in foreign trade and also wrote under the pen name the Kennebecer, recalled that the waters of this stretch of the river were famous for its seining ground, and it was not unusual among great quantities of herring, shad, or bass in their season to see 30 salmon hauled at once. Shad and river herring runs numbered in the millions, and salmon in the hundreds of thousands. Sturgeon was also a significant fishery, and the name of Cabasacanti Stream, which enters the river just below here in Gardiner, means plenty of sturgeon. Logging has always been a major industry in Maine, starting with the majestic white pine trees that were reserved for masts for the king's ships. There was a large lumber mill at Gardiner by 1750, and by the 1820s there was extensive logging upriver, with mills at Augusta and Fairfield, among other places. 50 years later, there were 34 sawmills on the river. Logging was a multi-season business. Trees were cut in the winter when the ground was hard enough that teams of oxen, mules, or horses could drag them to the nearest stream or river, where they were left on the ice. With the changing of the season, fed by melting snow and ice and spring rains, the streams and rivers would sweep logs in their tens of thousands downstream. Enormous rafts of logs were floated down the Kennebec from as far away as Moosehead Lake, more than 100 miles north of here. Blazed with various symbols to indicate their owners, like branded cattle, the logs were corralled into the booms to be sorted for distribution further downstream. From Hallowell, rafts of up to 4,000 logs could be towed as far as Wiscasset to be milled. The pickers, as the men who did the sorting were called, lived in floating bunkhouses anchored on the Chelsea side of the river, like the two shown here to the right. The booms and rafts, to say nothing of stray logs, obviously posed significant challenges to anyone attempting to navigate on the river. Captain Drew, the Kennebecker, gave neighboring Farmingdale the nickname Boomingdale, in honor of its log boom, the piers of which still dot the river from Farmingdale to Browns Island and beyond. Another extractive industry of great significance was Hallowell granite, which was particularly good for sculptural work, but was also used for general construction in places like the Hubbard Free Library and the Capitol Building in Augusta, and as distant as Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, and Houston. Granite was first quarried here in 1815, and until the coming of the railroad it was shipped exclusively by water. Even after that, pieces too large to be carried by train were hauled by schooners. The Hallowell Granite Works owned two three-masted schooners, both built in Connecticut, which loaded granite by crane at a wharf near Temple Street. As was true throughout the state, from Stonington to Vinalhaven, the granite trade attracted a very diverse workforce, including many Scandinavian and Italian stone carvers, very much from away. The most curious of the Kennebec cargoes was ice. The ice trade was pioneered by Bostonian Frederick Tudor in 1814, and for almost half a century Massachusetts dominated the trade, shipping ice worldwide to the Caribbean, Brazil, India and Sri Lanka, Java, and China. In 1826, a supplier to Tudor named Rufus Page built the first large ice house on the Kennebec near Gardiner. But the trade here didn't mature until the Civil War, when New Yorker James L. Cheeseman began cutting ice on the Kennebec to supply the Union Army's medical department. After the war, the Kennebec's exports to cities from New York to Washington far exceeded Boston's. The center of the Maine ice trade was on the Kennebec between Merrymeeting Bay and Augusta. When the ice was at least a foot thick, operations would begin to cut it into blocks 12 by 22 inches square, the rule of thumb being that an acre of ice 12 inches thick netted about 1,000 tons of marketable ice before shipping. The blocks were stored in ice houses that lined the river until the spring thaw, when they were loaded into ships and insulated with a dunnage of ice chips and hay, coarse sawdust, or wood shavings. In 1891, Hallowell was home to 3 ice houses with a combined capacity of 37,000 tons. 2 were owned by the Kennebec Ice Company, and the third by the Knickerbocker Ice Company of Philadelphia. The trade came to an abrupt end at the turn of the century, thanks in part to Bath native Charles Morse's efforts to corner New York City's ice market, which helped drive the development of artificial ice-making technologies. And by the 1910s, the natural ice industry had all but collapsed. Between logging, winter ice, and ice harvesting, and the shallow, narrow, and twisting contours of the Middle Kennebec, it seems almost miraculous that there was any shipping at all on the river. But as we have seen, there was a lot of it in season. In addition to the seasonal hazards of ice and wood, there were also granite outcrops, like this one off Hallowell, which was removed by dynamite in the late 1800s to improve a channel from below Shepherd's Point to beyond the Hallowell business district. In fact, a lot of the granite for which Hallowell is renowned is at the bottom of the Kennebec, and the late river pilot and harbor master Arthur Moore noted that the combination of current and granite bottom made it difficult for ships to anchor there. After dugouts, which can be shaped with fire and rudimentary stone tools, the earliest watercraft in Maine were birch bark canoes. The Barnes Wabanaki canoe, pictured here at the Maine Maritime Museum, dates to the mid-1700s and is thought to be the oldest in existence. Lovely as schooners and lobster boats may be, if there is one watercraft that exemplifies Maine across all its generations, it is the canoe. The Wabanaki used these on rivers and lakes, on bays, and the open ocean. They fished and hunted sea mammals like porpoises from canoes. and they used them to transport their harvests, their household and trade goods, and their people in peace and war. Indigenous people across North America began building birch bark canoes probably in the first millennium before the Common Era, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. They are ideally suited for Maine's topography, being rugged enough to carry large cargoes and withstand the beating they get in the rapids or coastal waters, but light enough to portage between streams. While their ubiquity today makes it seem as though they were immediately embraced by English settlers, that is not the case. Only when people began taking to the water for leisure activities did settlers' descendants begin to appreciate their incredible utility for hunting, camping, and other recreational uses. The canoe pictured here is of traditional birch bark design and was purchased from an unknown Wabanaki canoe-wright who made them to rent to summer people on Mount Desert Island. Within 20 years, a number of companies in the Bangor area began mass-producing canvas-on-wood frame models. All wood, aluminum, and plastic canoes followed, but though the materials changed, the design remained essentially unchanged. Meanwhile, birch bark canoes were too time-consuming for Europeans to bother with, and they kept to their traditional designs and construction techniques. An early example of this was the bateau, the heavy pine-on-oak plank boat that French trappers adapted for river transportation early on, and that loggers used well into the 20th century, as seen in this photo. In the fall of 1775, Benedict Arnold led a force of 1,000 men on an expedition up the Kennebec and over to the Chaudière River for an assault on Quebec. Having sailed as far as Gardiner's town, now Pittston, Arnold's men embarked in 200 light bateaux that had been built in great haste by Reuben Coburn. The bateau was a poor choice of boat because they are very heavy to withstand the beating they are designed to take. But Coburn had to use unseasoned wood, so the boats couldn't even take the rough treatment they received. For the route across the chain of lakes and mountains of western Maine, birch bark canoes would have been far more suitable. As Captain Drew wrote towards the end of the 19th century, not so many years ago, Hallowell was the chief town of the surrounding country, the real head of navigation on the river. It might be called a seaport, for many ships were built and commanded and equipped here, and I have read Hallowell on their sterns in Liverpool docks and other ports of the world. But this was true earlier in the 19th century too, as can be seen in this painting of the 1828 brig Topaz in a Turkish port. The Topaz was the smaller of two brigs that E.G. Pierce built that year, measuring 193 tons and with a length of only 85 feet. Despite their relatively small size, vessels such as these were as adept in long distance as in coast-wide trade. Yet most of the vessels that called in Hallowell were engaged in coastal trade around Maine, New England, and the mid-Atlantic states, carrying agricultural produce, wood, finished goods, granite, and ice outbound, and manufactured goods, raw materials, and coal inbound. This shipping news column from 1833 shows that over only 6 days in July 1833, there were 30 schooners and 14 sloops arriving at or sailing from Hallowell and 13 other ports between Eastport and Washington, D.C. Traffic was heaviest between Hallowell and Boston, with 6 departures and 5 arrivals. But there were 6 vessels coming or going between Hallowell and both Salem and the mouth of the Merrimack River, Newburyport and Salisbury, and 5 between each of New York and Portland. As I mentioned before, Hallowell didn't build any steamboats, but Mainers embraced steam navigation, and Hallowell was no exception. The first steamer in commercial service in Maine was the Boston-built Tom Thumb. In 1818 or 1819, a sailing packet towed the Tom Thumb to the mouth of the Kennebec, from where it proceeded upriver to Bath under its own power. In 1823, Seward Porter's Kennebec Steam Navigation Company ordered the steamer Waterville from a yard in Bath for service between Bath and Augusta. The same year, Porter acquired the patent for service between Boston, Portland, and Bath. This enabled the company to offer weekly round-trip service between Augusta, thus inaugurating more than a century of passenger steamboat service between the capitals of Maine and Massachusetts. Early steamers tended to carry sails as backup propulsion, especially if they operated on salt water. In this 1854 advertisement for the elegant and fast sailing steamer Ocean Service between Hallowell and Boston, the stock image of a side-wheel steamboat shows neither masts nor rigging. When steam navigation first came to the Kennebec, Hallowell was a terminus for a number of services that ran as far as Boston, but later in the century it lost out to Gardiner, though there was a feeder service from Augusta provided by the Della Collins and other stern-wheelers. The choice of wheelbarrow boats, as stern-wheelers were known in this part of the world, was because of their shallow draft. As an article in the Rockland Courier-Gazette put it, wheelbarrow boats did not draw much more water than the width of a single paddle blade. Old rivermen claimed that they would float anywhere over the lawns and meadows near the river's bank if there happened to be a heavy dew upon the grass. Her shallow draft made her difficult to maneuver when the current was running strong, but the Della Collins ran for 26 years before being replaced by the new steamer City of Augusta.